Faithful Questions series. Glad to see everybody here this evening. Glad to see everybody online. Let's go ahead and begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, you give us the gift of marriage so that we can be fruitful and multiply. Help us to remember that great gift in all of our lives, and that we may serve you in that all that we do. We ask this through Christ our Lord and Savior. Amen. Okay. We're starting off this week with a new feature that ironically, although it seems obvious why I'm picking this patron saint tonight, it is not even this month that gave me this idea. So we are now going to have a patron saint of the month for Faithful Questions. Every month we will have a new saint who is our patron for this particular talk. And so, being about marriage tonight, being a week before Valentine's Day, today's patron is Saint Valentine, a real human being, a 3rd century Roman. He was either a priest or a bishop. There's some contention as to which he was. His big claim to fame was that he was being prosecuted by a Roman judge for spreading Christianity, and he was a little bit willing to entertain him, and he said, "What proof can you give me that this Jesus guy is real?" And he cured his daughter's blindness. And apparently he then wrote a letter to the daughter that was his Valentine, the first Valentine. That's where we get that from. That wasn't the end. He continued to evangelize, and he eventually ran out of his luck when he tried to evangelize Emperor Claudius II, and was eventually beheaded and martyred for his efforts. So, St. Valentine is a martyr of the early church and our patron for this evening. Okay, so our topic tonight is, how can our Catholic faith improve my marriage? As I was hearing that from the ambo, I was like, I should have stuck with our across the board or my across the board. This switch tense thing wasn't wise, but I stick with what I said, so. Overview for tonight, we're going to start with caveats and conditions because we're stepping into a very difficult topic that is going to have a lot of very pragmatic advice. And so I want to make sure I well set the table as to what I am suggesting through that advice. Then we're going to talk through a number of things that we believe as Catholics. We're going to that marriage is sacramental, that marriage unites a husband and wife as one, that marriage is life permanent. We'll have an intermission. Then after intermission, we'll talk about marriage is a life of service and marriage is life-giving, and then some miscellaneous advice around that. First, our standard introductory slides. For those of you in person, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand at any point. The only thing we ask is that you wait for us to bring you the microphone, and then you put that microphone right up to your mouth. Just touch your lips practically. Otherwise, they can't hear you online. As you all know at this point, I ask for feedback every month, and the feedback I got from you all last month is get rid of the popping sound, and the feedback I always get every month online is we can't hear the questions. And I'm doing things on my end to help with that, but what you can do to help me is get that microphone right up to your lips. For those of you online, if you would like to ask a question, what you should do is get logged in on YouTube. If you do that, it opens up the comment section on YouTube, and then you can talk with the other people watching. If you'd like to ask a question here, start your comment with all capitals, Deacon Question, and then within the same comment what your question is, and we'll do our best to answer it. The one note of advice is you are watching this about 1 minute behind when it actually happens, and then you type, so it may be a little while before we can answer your questions. And we'll have a couple of times around the intermissions at the end specifically designed to help you. If you don't have a YouTube account, you can go to deaconken.org/blog/chat and talk there. Okay, on to the caveats and the conditions. The first thing I want to say is because there's going to be a lot of practical advice tonight, I think it's always very important to be very practical, but the problem with practical is it doesn't apply to everybody. We all have situations that are unique to us, and what is good advice for one person is not necessarily good advice for another. So, take my practical suggestions as exactly that, suggestions that may or may not apply to you and your life. They are ideas to consider and are definitely not mandatory or required, and I'm not saying you're not being a good Catholic if you're not doing every single one of these things. Hopefully some of them will help you, but I am sure that some of them aren't going to fit that well. The other thing I was going to say is I'm generally going to be using a pretty traditional Western gender roles for this, but that is not fully necessary inside the Catholic faith. For about 4 years, my wife was the breadwinner of the family while I was trying to start a startup, and I eventually had to give up and go get a regular job, so I'm back to earning a regular income. But, that's okay, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We were doing our best as a family. So, we do have some norms here, but it is okay if they don't always match yours. Another thing I have in this talk tonight is advice for people who aren't yet married. Because, I would like this talk to be as generally applicable as possible. And one of the concerns I was always worried about is there's going to be people in the room who maybe are now married but didn't do some of these things. And they're going to say, oh, is my marriage in trouble because I didn't do these things? No, not necessarily. God works with us where we're at. Relax, don't worry that you didn't do everything on the list. And then finally, I am not at all claiming to be a marriage expert, nor do I have a perfect marriage. My wife and I have normal marital problems. We do our best, and I think we have a good marriage, but I wouldn't argue we have a perfect marriage, and nor am I holding myself up as some laudable example to follow. Much of this advice I actually have taken to myself and said, I need to do things X, Y, and Z better based on what the things that come to my mind to share with the group. Okay, so we'll get right into it. First thing I want to talk about is marriage is sacramental. And let's start with what a sacrament is, because a lot of times people forget that, right? We have 7 sacraments in the Catholic Church. And these are things instituted by Christ, which are perceptible signs, words, and actions accessible to our human nature. And by this action and the power of the Holy Spirit, they make present efficaciously the grace that they signify. Sometimes the way catechism words things is odd. In other words, they are a way for us to receive special graces from God. By participating in the sacraments, we are able to receive special graces. Christ has recognized that there are certain things we need most help with, in particular things like forgiveness and healing and all of these sorts of things, and so he gave us sacraments for them. And one of the things he knew that we would need a sacrament for is our marriages, and so he gave us a sacrament for that. Now, along those lines, in the church, there is the idea of a natural marriage and a sacramental marriage. Marriage is something that obviously transcends Christianity. You go to any other religion, and atheists for that matter, and they get married. So marriage can exist outside of a sacramental marriage. And we call those marriages natural marriages. They don't necessarily tap into the graces that one would receive through a sacramental marriage, but God does bless people outside of the sacrament. So this isn't even to say that their marriages aren't blessed in some way. They just don't have the graces of the sacramental. And so sacramental marriage can be viewed of as a refinement of natural marriage. It gives it a higher purpose, we get additional graces, and it becomes a vehicle for graces even beyond that. A couple of paragraphs from the Catechism that I thought were worth reading. By reason of their state in life and of their order, Christian spouses have their own special gifts in the people of God. This grace proper to the sacrament of matrimony is intended to perfect the couple's love and to strengthen their indissoluble unity. By this grace, they help one another to attain holiness in their married life and in welcoming and educating their children. Christ dwells with them, gives them the strength to take up their crosses and so follow him, to rise again after they have fallen, to forgive one another, to bear one another's burdens, to be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ, and to love one another with supernatural, tender, and fruitful love. I think that final statement is a wonderful summation of what we are shooting for in sacramental marriage. We are shooting for a supernatural love, something that transcends the natural, something that obviously is tender and compassionate, and that is also fruitful, because one of the main purposes of marriage is, of course, children. Marriage to that end is a covenant between three persons, between God, between man, and between woman. Marriage is a way to give us grace, and marriage is a way to give us purpose. Maybe as a little bit additional here that I don't think I have in these slides, but one of the things that came out of the Second Vatican Council was really trying to emphasize the value and purpose of the laity in the church. The church had done a pretty good job over the centuries about communicating the value of the priesthood, the value of bishops, all of these things, and it felt maybe it was a little underselling the value of the laity, how much they were important to the church. And as part of doing that, this theology was enriched. They really focused on the idea of a big part of the way the laity can participate in the church is by participating in the sacrament of marriage and receiving the graces and carrying out the purposes thereof. And so I think it's why we can talk about the sacrament of marriage, and in part why it is so important that the laity have this is because it is part of how they have their purpose within the church. It is part of how we all have our way to contribute to the higher good of God. Okay, so every section here we end with practical advice and then advice before marriage. So practical advice. I can say all of those things, and one could say, well, that's wonderful. What do I do with that? How do I turn that into something that I'm actually going to day-to-day improve my marriage? And the first thing I would say is praying together is very important. When we invoke God, we are taking that opportunity to grow closer to Him. And if we're not doing that with our spouse, or not doing it with them very often, we are missing a wonderful opportunity to have a shared sense of that connection. And if the sacrament of marriage is between God, the man, and the woman, it really helps for the man and the woman to be praying together to God to complete that loop. So making sure to take that time to pray together, to pray to understand the graces you have, to pray in thanksgiving, and then also to pray about what your purpose is as man and wife in your marriage. And I would say to that end, and I'm generally a big fan of this, when we pray, sometimes we get some thoughts that are meaningful to us, and we too often just leave them in our head, and we don't work enough on them. And I would say if you are praying with your spouse and you're praying about the purpose of your marriage and all of that, and in that prayer time something comes to you that is important, you should write it down. And particularly I think for two people, I think that can be very valuable because it's now something that you have shared in writing down, right? When we write something down that is, like in my house, important written things all end up with a magnet on the refrigerator. That's how we do things, right? So like when I went on my diet, there was a big sheet of paper with a huge sticker on it saying, do this, don't do that, please help me with X, Y, and Z. That's the bulletin board of our house, right? And so I think that we would put something down there, and writing it down and putting it in a place that is public for the two of you, maybe it's private for the rest of the household, is a good thing to do. Then the next thing I would say is when we are praying privately, we should be working very hard to be praying for our spouse's needs and desires. A huge part of marriage, and we're going to get to this in the next section, is being fully united with them. One of the best ways to help ourselves get there is to make their desires and wishes our desires and wishes. And what is one of the most profound ways we can make sure that happens is by making sure our prayer life is doing its best to communicate to God the other person's desires and wishes and needs. So when we pray for them as if it was them, we are really fulfilling our marital purpose. And if the both of you are doing that, I think it can bear great fruits. Now, obviously, there's still plenty of time for your own needs and your own wishes, but I think it's a wonderful thing to spend a significant part of your prayer time praying for the wishes and desires of your spouse. A couple more pieces. For those of you who maybe are stepping up your religious game, you're trying to do better, maybe you had a marriage that didn't have a strong religious component earlier, and it has grown a religious component, consider renewing your vows, doing something with the church, maybe your 10th anniversary or 25th anniversary or your 50th anniversary, whatever it may be, to really bring out and remind yourself what maybe you didn't remember when you were 22 and you naively stepped into marriage. So I think considering doing that is a good idea. My wife and I specifically talked about, even though I think we did a good job initially of renewing our vows at 25 years, which is a year and a half away, year and a quarter away. Time flies. And then finally, I think displaying the religious aspects of your wedding, pictures of the church. You know, I get so disappointed when I see, oh, here's my, wedding album or my wedding collage. And even people who got married in a church, the picture is always the waterfall or the big trees, background and all of that. And not enough of them are the devotional religious pictures that hopefully you got the photographer to take. And I think those should be more prominent in there. And at least in my home, there's 3 big pictures that we have, and one of the 3 of them is, from us kneeling in front of the altar during the wedding. Before marriage advice, here's where we're going to hit probably the hottest topic in today's world. For those of you who aren't married, I would strongly consider, you should strongly consider marrying a Catholic. I know this is not what the world wants to talk about today, but marriage, you are stepping into a world where both of your needs are very important, and if you are not on the same page with religion, you are going to add a significant strain to, at a minimum, your faith life. And here's from the Catechism, and I think this is extremely well stated and why I'm going to read from it. Differences of confession between the spouses does not constitute an insurmountable obstacle for marriage, but the difficulties of mixed marriages must not be underestimated. Disparity of cult can further aggravate these differences. The first phrasing is about people who are different kinds of Christian. Disparity of cult would be a Christian and a non-Christian, just for clarity's sake. Differences about faith and the very notion of marriage, but also different religious mentalities, can become sources of tension in marriage, especially in regards to the education of children. Now, I think the Catechism, it's doing its best to be pretty charitable here by saying it's not an insurmountable obstacle. But my thought would be marriage can be hard enough without introducing obstacles, whether they are insurmountable or not. And this is one we should be very reluctant to consider undertaking. And so for those of you who aren't married, you've got your big list of things you're looking for in your future partner. Catholic needs to be a big part of that list. it has been a blessing to my marriage. If I look at the people who have healthy faith lives, the percentages where they are of a mixed marriage are pretty small. If you look at the vast majority of people who have active faith lives, their spouse is at a minimum Catholic, as in most cases is active along with them. So I would definitely consider that important. And then to that end, and part of why finding a Catholic makes this easier, is that before you get married, the two of you really need to embrace the idea that this is a godly union. And make sure that your mate feels the same way, that they really understand. Like, as much as marrying a Catholic is important, there are plenty of Catholics who don't really get their faith and don't get some of these things. And so even if they are Catholic, you need to be sitting down and talking to them about, do you really understand that we are joining into a godly union, and do you feel the same? And if they don't, they're like, meh, that should be a pretty big red flag early on. And then along those lines, start the habit, even before you get married, of praying together to find out, kind of as one of those things, is to figure out how things are going to go in your eventual marriage. That took way longer than planned. All right. Next topic, united as one. This idea that we become one in marriage. I won't read the catechism paragraph. Question for everyone in the group. What is the most obvious and visible way couples become one flesh? Anyone want to shout it out for me? Okay, we're on the right track, but children, that's right, children. Right. But yes, absolutely, obviously sex is a big part of that. I've yet to find, I'm aware of one child who was born without sex, but that was a really special case. But yes, I mean, think about what happens in the sexual union that makes a child. You take one person's DNA, you split it in half, and then you take another person's DNA and you split that in half, and you take those two halves and you smush them together, and that is the child. Quite literally, they are the fundamental building blocks of your flesh combined into one person. We really do become one flesh in our children in the most fundamental building block kind of way. I find it so meaningful, and I think it's something that's so inherent that we just get in our gut, but it's nice to see the science backs up what our gut is thinking. So we really become one through our children, but that's not the only way we become one, right? It's a spiritual unity as well. And the catechism paragraph backs that up. Some practical advice of how to be unified as one. This was something I think I learned when I got laid off and then ended up working my little startup company, and my wife had the more traditional out-of-the-home job. I took on some of the things that she used to do. In particular, in my case, it was grocery shopping. And actually, even now that I'm back to work, I still do the grocery shopping. And all of a sudden, the things that she would complain about or wasn't happy with or frustrated with, including like, you guys won't tell me what you want, and I have to go to the grocery store and figure it out, all now made 10 times more sense than it did beforehand. I mean, I got it. I believed her, but there's a difference between believing and really getting it. And then when it's your job to go to the grocery store and you're like, my kids won't tell me what they want, and I have to figure out what to buy, and then it sits in the freezer never getting eaten, it really connects. And so I don't think this is something you have to do for all the chores. I don't think it's something that you have to do frequently. But I do think over the course of a marriage, there is some value in switching up some roles, that doing some of the things one would do that the other one would now do. Obviously, there's certain things that won't switch easily, just for very pragmatic reasons. I doubt my wife will ever be mowing the lawn. She's a small, feminine woman. I don't see her doing that. We have a bit of a hill around our house. But there's other things that she might take on that currently I do. So I think there's some value in switching up some responsibilities within the marriage over time. Another really big one, and this is one that I see so many couples making big mistakes in, is separate money. You just cannot have separate money in your life. You have to have a united sense of money. And there are a few things you can do to really drive this home. Number one, joint accounts, right? Don't have my checking account and your checking account. Have your checking account. Now, there are pragmatic reasons that sometimes people feel the need to do that, and I wouldn't say you should never do it, but you have to talk a lot more about money when you're cutting a check and her cutting a check at the same time may cause an overdraft than if you have separate accounts. And that's a good thing. It's forcing communication. It's forcing you to talk about things and to really get into it. Along those lines, budgets, right? Talking about how much money you're going to spend, how you're going to spend it, how much of that is groceries, how much of that is hobbies, etc., I think is very, very healthy. And again, joint accounts kind of force you to start thinking about those things. To that end, you need to really retrain your thinking. Every dollar that the family receives, it doesn't matter whether it comes from my job or my wife's job, it's our money. And every dollar out that is spent is our money spent. We have a joke between my wife and I, we'll bet $10, and then whoever wins, I'll transfer it from my account to ours, right? Is the joke that we use, right? Which it's all the same account, so it doesn't matter. But really, the idea of separate in money is an area of division. That may not be a divisive thing, but it is not a unifying thing. And when your money is united, it encourages and forces a certain set of unity. I would say that also goes to the items you have in your home. Do you have his and her tablets, or do you have two family tablets that anybody might use? Is there a man cave or a sewing room or whatever in your home that is not that way just for pragmatic reasons, but really there's a sense of this is my room or this is your room? Like, my wife does not spend a lot of time out in the wood shop, but I don't think it's mine, right? It's the household wood shop, and the fact that my wife is not into, smelling like wood chips, that's why she's not out there that often. But it's our in the house. And then finally, praying together. We want to be unified. Praying together is a great way to do that. Advice for before marriage. Guard, and this is particularly true for those of you who are maybe not quite as young. One of the benefits of getting married in your early 20s, which was obviously the norm a generation ago and is much less common today, is that you're not very set in your ways. You end up figuring out life together. As people are starting to get married in their later 20s and their 30s, people are getting much more set in their ways. They're gaining some wisdom, and so there's certain ways I think there's value to delaying marriage, but I think you have to be very much on guard about getting set in your ways and your marriage just being two people who are set in their ways who happen to be adjacent to one another. That's not real marriage. Real marriage, both of you are being heavily influenced by the other. So try, particularly if you're not as young, to be very on guard about things where you are set in your ways and unwilling to move when you get married. Along those lines, do not set any conditions of marriage. I'm getting married because, you're going to be a dentist eventually is kind of the traditional, feminine way of it. And if you don't end up being a dentist, I'm not happy, right? That kind of thinking. There are the inverse things as well. People who are expecting wives to stay at home with a brood of children, and then you're infertile. There's all kinds of ways that you can have conditions going in, that this is what you expect is going to happen in this marriage eventually, that may or may not happen. So you need to go into marriage saying, whatever happens, I'm hitching my wagon to yours, and we're going to be together. And if that's half the children we thought, or 3 times the children we thought, or whatever, or broke, or rich, or sick. What are the things? And I'm not going to do it because I'll mess it up. But you know the words that they say in the wedding vows. Those are there for a reason. And too many people in these days enter into marriage with very specific expectations. And when those don't pan out, a lot of people end up getting divorced. So avoid that. Speaking of which, life permanent. We believe that marriage is until one of you dies, that as long as you're both alive, you are obligated to each other. Again, I'll read the catechism on this one. By its very nature, conjugal love requires the inviolable fidelity of the spouses. This is the consequence of the gift of themselves which they make to each other. Love seeks to be definitive. It cannot be an arrangement until further notice. The intimate union of marriage as a mutual giving of two persons and the good of the children demand total fidelity from the spouses and require an unbreakable union between them. I'll go more into how that plays out in the pragmatic section. The kind of inverse caveat of this that is important to remember is it's only life permanent. We hopefully all remember the story of Jesus when they talk to him about the woman who ends up marrying 7 brothers and who is she married to in heaven. And what Jesus says is, why am I missing it? Anyway, the point is that, boy, I feel like it's not in here. There you go. That's the line I'm looking for. When they rise from the dead, they are neither married nor given in marriage. The idea being that marriage is for this life, and it is not something for the afterlife. So he makes it clear that marriage is not something that will transcend this life. Divorce, or even the hint of divorce, is an extremely corrosive thing. I think there are lots of people today who end up with horrible marriages and end up getting divorced, that if they lived in a different era where just nobody got divorced, they would be happy and they would have good lifelong marriages. Because what do people do when they're worried that someone that they want to give their whole heart to may bolt? You withdraw. You pull back. You say, gee, I don't know if I want to commit that hard. That person may bolt on me. And as soon as you introduce that idea, the idea that the other may leave, it plays on both sides. The husband says, geez, she's looking like she's not too pleased with me. I don't know if I want to commit my heart even deeper to this because she might bolt. And she's looking on the exact same side saying the same thing. And if both of them could just get beyond the idea that that was out there, they both might make that profound commitment to one another that they wouldn't otherwise make. The fact that this has become a normative thing in our culture is so corrosive, and we need to completely eliminate the idea of it from our minds and our Catholic marriages and have absolute confidence for those of you who haven't yet entered into marriage that this person feels exactly like I do. We are getting married and we are going down with the ship if that's what happens, because we are that committed to each other. To say that in exactly the inverse, in the positive light, although ironically this might sound a little negative, one of the things I love about my marriage to my wife is that we don't spend a lot of time angry with each other, because we know there's no benefit in dragging it out. You know, we're committed to each other. We're going to stay married, and if one of us is messed up, the best thing to do is figure out a way to get beyond that quickly, because we're going to stay married. There's no doubt here. And so it has us working on our problems very proactively, very early. We have 2 choices: solve the problem or be miserable for longer. There is no get out option. And because of that, I think, again, we work on our problems and we solve them quickly. And kind of to this next point, we often take the long view. Okay, things aren't as great as we would like right now because of X, Y, or Z, because we're kind of broke because we got 2 kids going into college. But that's okay, because there's no end here in that sense. We're just going to keep working through things, and there's no reason to torture ourselves over things that aren't perfect right now. We just keep chipping away at them. It's one of the things I most love about my marriage, in addition that she's awesome, but that we don't spend a lot of time torturing ourselves over our problems. We just are proactive and we work on them and we do our best. And sometimes we know that's going to take years, but that's okay, because we know we've got, illnesses aside, plenty of years left. To that end, being flexible is very important, right? We can't have these ideas of, this is what I expect from you and this is what you expect from me. And while some of those things can be positive, when they become negative, we need to shed them quickly. And along those lines, forgiveness is very important. One of the things I advise people a lot about confession is confess. There we go. Okay, we should have audio back now, yes? Okay. Always something. All right. So, forgiveness, very important. Apologies online. We recognize we lost the audio. We got through it as quick as we could. Before marriage advice, again, really be sure that that person you are working with is in it for the long haul, that they get that this is a lifelong union. And really make sure that that other person, before you sign on the dotted line, feels the same way. You'll be a lot happier if you do so. Okay. Okay. So we're going to go to intermission. Again, sorry for the audio problems. We'll work through them in just a second. For those of you online, if you have a question you'd like to ask, now is a good time to get it in, because as I said, you're about a minute behind us. So during the intermission, we'll get them queued up. We'll answer them immediately after the intermission. So get logged in on YouTube and then type all capitals Deacon Question. And if you can't, go to deaconken.org/blog/chat. We'll have that on the bar while we're off at break. So we will see everybody in 5 minutes. All right. What do we have as far as online questions? No online questions. Okay. Questions in the room before we go into the aspects of service that are within the in marriage. Any questions people want to ask? We'll have time at the end as well for more questions. Oh, questions over here. Okay. Oh, got to wait for the microphone.
So it's a recurrent theme that obviously bears great importance. So when you talk about praying together, it just so happens that I'm one of those that chose a non-Catholic to marry. We got a dispensation to marry in the Catholic Church. However, praying together has been one of those awkward things. So I want to encourage it, but at the same time, I don't want to discourage him from being inquisitive or curious or deepening his own faith at his, on his own terms.
Right.
Do you have any practical examples of what that would look like for people that are of a mixed marriage?
And so in your case, what's his background, or Lutheran? So my thought there is there's so much potential commonality between Lutherans and Catholics that, and particularly because even amongst Protestants, they are not ones that shy away from many of the things that we are open to as Catholics. The more what evangelicals would call rote, repetitive prayer. Lutherans, are at least conceptually open to something like the Rosary, even if it's not normative to them. And so my thought is, just find things that work for you and be willing to be honest about this area of minor conflict, and be willing to, include things that are comfortable for both of you. And maybe that even means a little bit of switching off, okay? Would you be willing to try a rosy with me if I try a whatever with you, kind of thing? And so finding things that you like together, finding things where you can influence each other, are things that you can do. But I think you're in a much better situation than, say, somebody who marries an agnostic, or somebody, or even just somebody of a very different faith where there's very little prayer commonality. But with a Lutheran and a Catholic, there's so much room for commonality. I think it's just working to find those commonality points. Up front here.
Thank you. I, too, am married to a non-Catholic. And one of the things we do that's been helpful, we don't pray the whole rosary together, but we'll pray one decade together. And then we work that out together. And sometimes he kind of falls asleep, but it's okay. It's okay. There's a lot of mutual respect going on. So
I've done a lot of 2/3 rosaries, and I wake up in the morning going, where are my rosary beads? So, Jesus knows what we were aiming for, even if we didn't finish it. Yeah, and I think to kind of come back to this idea of commonality, to some degree, we don't need to make it any more complicated than what we're doing for date night, right? For date night, we have different interests, and sometimes we do your thing, sometimes we do my thing, and sometimes we find something that we, really share in common. And I think we can take that same attitude with prayer, right? We don't have to overcomplicate it unnecessarily. Real close. I think you might be muted there, Peter. Try again.
So next month, my wife and I are going to hit 50 years on St. Patrick's Day. And the only reason I bring that up is that I want to affirm a lot of the points you're making. Every time you made a point, I was thinking, yeah, we do that. And, oh, yeah, we do that, we do that, we do that, we do that. And so here we are 50 years later, and I think that you're spot on with all the things, except for one thing.
Okay.
You know that thing about no man cave? well, I don't have a man cave, but she has a she cave.
A she cave?
And it's a craft room in the house because we, after the kids left, we had the space. So she has that.
Right.
No,
And
that's about the only thing.
The thing that's important there, it's not so much about whether there are rooms dedicated to certain purposes. The question is whether it's a place you go to retreat from the marriage. Right? And that's actually, when I think man cave, that's really what's going on. It is a place where the man feels he can go to get away from his wife. That's what the term man cave means. So, a she cave, it could exist as well, but that doesn't mean a room that's full of crafts that isn't your favorite room in the house is a she cave. It's just a room where she does her crafts. And if it's not a place where she's going to retreat from you, then it's not something to be worried about. So, yeah, I mean, some people would, and we have to be careful with what we mean by the term man cave. If having a big room with a big Dolby surround sound movie theater room, a lot of people would call that a man cave because it's something men tend to be more interested in. But if it's a room that the wife is every bit as involved in and welcome in, then in this sense, it's not what I mean by a man cave. What I mean by a man cave is a room where you retreat from your spouse. And a lot of men, when they want a man cave, that's the goal. The goal is a place they can escape their wife. And that's bad news, right? That's not a good thing. And both husband and wife should be worried about that desire, right? Yeah. All right, life of service. And this is actually, I think, one of the more important ones from changing how we think. Like some of the other, like a life permanent one is one of those that even if we don't buy into it, we see it, we get it, we know it's there. But this is one of those that really is about changing the way you look at the union. Do you look at the union as a contract? You get X, I get X. X and Y, X squared is positive. Or do you look at this is a life of service for you and a life of service for your spouse? That's the right way to look at it. A marriage is not for us to get something. A marriage is for us to join together in service of others, our children, church, the world. Not going to read it. We are called to serve just as human beings, whether we are married or not. We are called to a life of service. But when we get married, we get some specifics or some purpose to that. We are called to serve Christ and by extension society. We are called to serve one another. One of the things that breaks my heart the most is when I hear of marriages that fail when one of the person really needs the other. I heard of a couple where the woman really struggled with postpartum depression, and she wasn't being a good wife. In a certain light, you could see why the husband was saying, she completely retreated from me, she doesn't want to be around me, she doesn't want to be around the kids, all of these things. And he said, I just can't take it anymore. And so he left. And it broke my heart because it's the moment when he is most called to serve. He was brought into that marriage to be there for her in that moment, to be the one person that nobody else could be for her in that moment. And because he could not see marriage as a life of service to the other, because he saw it in contractual terms of we're doing this because I enjoy it and she enjoys it, and since I no longer enjoy it, I want out, he could not see through to the very thing he needed to be. And the worst part about that is, what goes around comes around. Later in his life, he's going to reach that same moment for himself. And he's not going to have somebody there to be that person for him. And that's the beauty of marriage. When we are at our worst, when we most need somebody, we have somebody there for us. and vice versa. When there's somebody out there that we are called to have a special dedication and service to. It's interesting, we see it more with our children, right? We get that sense that we brought these children into the world and we are called profoundly to be there for them. You know, a murderer's on trial. His mother's still there pleading for mercy because she's his mother. It's her job to plead for mercy for her son, even if he's done something terrible. And we don't have any trouble seeing that. We don't say, I'm writing him off. No, we get that fundamental sense of for our children, it doesn't matter. You know, we may debate what's the best way to help them, but at the end of the day, we get that our job is to help our children, to be there for them, even when things are terrible. And what we need to do is get to that same place with our spouses, where it is that simple and fundamental. Practical advice. Work very, very hard to avoid thinking of marriage in contractual terms. Are we just, you get X, I get Y. Along those lines, you'll hear people talk about keeping points or something related to that. I'm doing this because I know next month I'm going to want that. And by putting in this now and by buttering her up now, she'll be more likely to let me buy that big piece of astronomy equipment I've been looking for, right? That kind of thinking where we are doing something in contractual terms, even if we recognize that it's not, binding, but we're thinking that way. We're thinking in terms of scratching each other's back to get what we want. That's thinking contractually. And we really want to avoid that. We want to give without any sense of getting something in return and trusting that the other person is doing the same. In general, I would say this means thinking in terms of turning outwardly. The best marriages I know don't spend a ton of time. I mean, they do what they need to have a healthy union, but their life is more focused outward than it is focused inward. They are looking at what they can be doing for their children. They are looking what they can be doing for their community. They're involved in some club or organization. They're very outwardly focused. And in general, that is a much healthier way to live life in general, but I think it's even more important in marriage. And by the way, one of the reasons that children are a great blessing in marriage, because it is a way for the couple to think in outward terms. It's from a couple's perspective outwardly. The children are obviously part of the family, but it's a great place to start in that regard, and it helps us thinking outwardly. In some sense, even though obviously it's a very sad thing to hear, you hear about those couples who stick around and then either because they knew they wanted to get divorced as soon as the kids ran off, or they didn't even recognize it, but then once they got to that point and they're staring at somebody they don't really know, then they get divorced. There's a certain healthiness before they reached that moment, that they were outwardly focused. What they were unable to do, unfortunately, is then turn the corner to a different sense of outwardly focused after the children aren't the centering point of that outwardness. And so we have to be ready for that idea that it's not just about outwardness towards the children, that it's outwardness in general. But hopefully, if we recognize that and we sense that the children have trained us to think that way, it puts us in a better place for when one becomes an empty nester eventually. Before marriage advice, really embrace this idea that it is a life of service. And again, make sure the person you're marrying feels the same way. Be a service-oriented person in your single life. And again, pick someone who appears to be a service-oriented person in their personal life. These are one of those things you can just tell. I think if you meet a fellow Catholic at St. Vincent de Paul and you hit it off, that's a great starting place. Life-giving. Obviously, this is a little bit of an obvious one, but we'll get into this. By its very nature, the institution of marriage and married life is ordered to the procreation and education of the offspring, and it is in them that it finds its crowning glory. I think as Catholics, we don't have a hard time with this for the most part, but don't doubt that society very much doesn't understand this anymore. One of the examples that really stuck in my mind when the gay marriage decision came down, the federal court decision, I read it from tip to toe to understand it. And he laid out very fairly what the arguments were of both sides. It read very, unbiased. And he laid down that the big argument where you could argue that this wasn't a case of discrimination was the issue of children. That's one of the huge things that put a heterosexual marriage pragmatically different than a homosexual marriage. And he noted that this was strongly mentioned in the court case, and that was their big argument. And he brushed it entirely aside and said, we just don't, these aren't the words he used, obviously, but he said, that's just not the way it is anymore. Tons of marriages have no interest in children. Tons of people get married without thinking about children. Therefore, that is no longer a requirement of marriage. Therefore, it is no longer something you can say as a defining characteristic that allows you to discriminate against homosexual couples. That was the logic in the court ruling, plain and simple. And to some degree, from a American legal perspective, I don't know that I can disagree with them. I mean, I disagree with the decision, but at a simple legal perspective, that's true. And this is one of those cases where this shows how much contraception has changed the world. You make that argument in 1850, and people would just laugh at you. It would be the most ridiculous thought ever. It's only in a contraceptive culture that we could reach a place that we would say that. That you could have, 200 years ago, if somebody got married and within a year there wasn't a kid, it was a tragedy. What happened? Oh my gosh, there's something sad going on here. That was what you expected. Now it's, when we got married, and this is, 25 years ago now, when are you going to have kids? That was the question, right? And so at least coming from our standpoint, the thought was when, not if, but it was our decision on our timeline was the way they looked at it, right? And then when you have 2, 3, 4 kids, people all of a sudden say, oh, is that your last one? All of these kinds of questions that are very controlling, as if this is something we can choose or not choose to do within marriage. And it's very much not how we look at it as Catholics. Children are the supreme gift of marriage, and they contribute greatly to the good of the parents. It is not good that man should be alone. That's not just the wife, but it's also the children. Be fruitful and multiply. Right from the beginning of Scripture, this is what is set up. Practical advice. There used to be a little thing in the corner. I'm laughing because I've used a slide in a previous talk. It said, warning, rant from Deacon Ken coming. I feel it coming right now. Lust is a huge problem in our society. We don't even know as a society how to differentiate between lust and love. We don't even get that this idea is separate from each other. And at some level, we know these are different things, but so much of what we would call lust, or what we would call love today, is actually lust. So let's define lust. Lust is desiring to use the other person as an object for your own sexual gratification. Anytime you look at a person and you say, I would enjoy the fruits of that sexual union, that's lust. You're saying, I want the sexual gratification. That person would be a good vehicle for that. A lot of people, in fairness to them, look at it from the perspective of, and it'd be nice if they felt the same way. I'm cool with the idea that this is a contractually beneficial thing. They get sexual gratification. I get sexual gratification. We're both winning. Hurrah. but that is fundamentally a lustful thing. You are both desiring using the other person as a sexual object. Love is not about that. Love is selfless. It is not concerned with self-gratification. It is concerned with care for the other. We are so bound up in a lustful view of sex. I must admit, I sometimes struggle in my own mind to keep these ideas properly ordered. It's like, well, then it's almost like, well, then what is sex? I have to think about it. Well, what is it if I'm not interested in gratification? What am I after? Why am I doing it? My wife and I are reaching that point of our lives where we're not expecting any more children. We've kind of, crossed that threshold. So then what is it now? Should we be doing it all? All these questions start popping in. And I think it's because we live in a society that so views sex in lustful terms that it makes it hard for even those of us who are trying not to look at it that way. We struggle even then to have a sense of what it is. But what I would generally say is if we are entering into a sexual moment with our partner and our fundamental mindset is, I would like gratification, we're in a lustful place. We have to be patient with ourselves, figure these things out over time. I wouldn't advise people to stop their sexual relationships, particularly that have built up over years. If they're noticing this in themselves, give yourself the time to learn how to view sex in a different lens. But you should be working, and I'm saying this to myself, working to, over time, changing it from something that is about from something that is about getting gratification to union with that person. And those are very different things. So, and this is kind of along these lines. I think I've been staying this by going around it. There can be lust within a marriage. A lot of people, I think the church actually made some mistakes in this because they kind of gave the idea that, sex outside of marriage was bad and sex inside of marriage was good. And that gave a false impression to a lot of people that things that you wouldn't be okay with outside of marriage are now okay in marriage. And that's not true, right? No, you can still have lust inside a marriage. And that's still a real possibility. Kind of on to the younger folks, being open to children and numerous children is a great way to properly order your sexual life. As I've becoming a deacon longer and longer, more and more people come to me to talk about their problems and their issues, and it's all over the map. It's not just in this space, thank God. I haven't yet heard somebody say, I wish I didn't have my last child. But I've heard a number of people say, I wish I had had more. I think we've gotten to this place where in society, again, where we're always trying to say, oh, we could have too many. Oh, we can't afford it. Oh, there's all these reasons. And I think we'll do a lot better to be much more open and remember that children is a cup that can overflow and still be a wonderful cup. One of the things I'd like to point out that, at least for me, has been a wonderful thing to love my wife even more is I have seen in my children the weakest parts of my wife. And it has helped me to love my wife's weaknesses. Because you can't help but love your children even in their most weakest moments. Right? If they're not very, like, well, in this case, this is me. If they're not very artistic, that probably came from me. I am just, I'm not one of the, I can draw you a great graph of an engineering problem. You ask me to, make some leaves on a tree. It's not going to be pretty. In fact, during formation, they asked you to draw an anatomically correct man and a woman. And I was like, okay, I'll do my best, but just so you know, I suck at drawing. It's like not because I'm not trying. And my point of this is couple of my children aren't that artistically gifted as well. And I'd say that in part comes from me. And I would hope that my wife would see in them that, have compassion for them, and then through that have compassion for me. Because I know the inverse is true. When I see my wife's weaknesses in my children, I have great compassion for them, and it helps me to be more compassionate of my wife in those same weaknesses. So I don't know, maybe just the reason I bring it up is I think pointing it out may help us to see a vehicle for when we have those things that we struggle with our spouse. We go, this drives me nuts about my husband or my wife. Do you see those same characteristics in your children? Is there a way they don't drive you nuts in them? Can you then transfer that to your spouse to treat them with the same kind of compassion? For those of you who are struggling with infertility issues, this has not been my cross to bear, but there are lots of ways to be parent-like without having your own children. One of Wendy's siblings has been unable to have children, and we've seen in them this healthily played out. So there are lots of options. Obviously, adoption is one of them. And actually, her sibling did not choose that after looking into it, decided it wasn't the right way for them. But you can do things like coach a kid's baseball team. You can volunteer to work with kids at church. Are you an aunt or an uncle? You can be engaged with those kinds of things. There are lots of ways to engage for those. I don't think there's many in this room who fit this bucket, but maybe for the online community, if you are infertile and you're looking at all this stuff of children, why do you keep rubbing it in my face? We'd love to have children, but we're not able. And I have great sympathy for you, but I would also say you can still live out that service without your own children. And I would encourage you to consider finding ways to do that, because it is one of the gifts of marriage, is the children-like relationship. And there's other ways to do it besides biological children. Before marriage advice, live chastely. The whole idea of we need to make sure we're sexually compatible, you hear that all the time. Huge mistake. That'll work itself out. Another one, don't get married until you're ready to have children. Because if you're truly going to live out this life of sex as a procreative thing in its fundamental nature, you need to be ready to have children as soon as you enter into that union. That's a likely scenario. And then finally, be open to the possibility that one of you is infertile. That's a real possibility. That can strike. You don't hear about it as much. You hear a little bit more about the opposite, but it's a tragedy for a lot of people, and with good reason, when they don't have children, when they entered into marriage hoping for and expecting them. And this is part of that, till death do us part, for better or for worse. And you, as a married couple, need to be ready for that possibility and ready for the idea that that's not an excuse to get out of this, that no, we got married no matter what was going to happen. All right, some final practical advice that doesn't fit into these nice buckets of sacraments and service and all these things that just I think are good advice. Some of them are religious in nature, many of them are not. It's important to remember that even though we as Catholics elevate marriage to this higher level of the sacramentalness, it has most of the trappings of a natural marriage as well. And so we can look at general societal healthy advice about marriage to help our sacramental marriages. We don't have to ignore that advice just because it doesn't come from a sacramental place. And so I did a bunch of research on what are the biggest societal causes of divorce. And there are 4 things that they mentioned: economic strife, low education, substance abuse, and large differences in age, culture, education, or family wealth. These are the things that tend to make couples have trouble. I would put the religious differences thing as part of that last one. It kind of fits in the same bucket. The low education status, I think, while it's true, I think it's the most surmountable of the bunch if you really understand what it means to be married. But the others we need to be very aware of, particularly for those who aren't married yet, and be aware of the risks that come with them. And I'm going to talk more about economic strife, but particular things like substance abuse, you need to be very wary of substance abuse issues if you aren't yet married. It can be a big, big problem. Economic advice. The number one thing I would say to every person, married, not married, whatever, is get out of debt. We live in a society that loves to sell us debt, loves to tell us the benefits of being in debt because you can have your new motorcycle right now, right, or whatever it may be. Debt is a form of slavery. You are enslaved to that bank, to that entity, until you give them your money. They have no choice. The church used to be much more strongly against the ideas of debt. They called it usury, right? And now we've kind of we still believe it's there, but we've kind of defined usury a little different, that it's unreasonable interest and stuff like that. And I think we made a little bit of a mistake. I think any true debt is a bad thing. I think a good way to define debt is as if the amount of money you owe on your assets is more than you could sell them for quickly, then you're in debt. So I don't think, while a mortgage is at some level a form of debt, it's not the same as, say, credit card debt. Because right now, my wife and I, we do have a mortgage, but our house is worth way more than that. And if we both lost our jobs and we needed to do something different for housing, we could sell the house, take the cash, figure out what we wanted to do. We would not be enslaved to it. But if that house didn't have that much value, and you saw people like this during the recession, they had no choice. They owed more than the house was worth. They were stuck, and they had to declare bankruptcy or do something really nasty if they wanted out from underneath it. So if you have an asset tied to your debt, and that asset is worth a lot more than the debt, while I wouldn't say it's a wonderful thing, I think you're not truly as enslaved. You have a way to exit that debt whenever you want. The real debt to worry about is the debt where you can't do that. Credit card debt being the most obvious. I think vehicles can also be that, right? Because when you get the car, it loses value very quickly, and it's worth far less than the loan on it is for quite a while. You just hear tons of stories of economic strife because people got in debt. And if they had figured out a way to live more frugally up front, they would not have that strife that would have stressed their marriage. Along those lines, and this is one my wife and I did that we were very proud of, if you both work, live so that your base requirements can be met by one income, right? Don't get the big house with the big mortgage that requires that both of you work. Maybe it's going to be tight, but get the one that if only one of you had your job, you could still make the mortgage payment. It gives you a huge amount of flexibility. When I lost my job, we were pretty bare bones when I lost my job, but we were able to still make our payments. We didn't have to move out of our house. All of those things still clicked. And we could have been in real trouble if we had bought a house that required both of us to work. The other way that really comes out for you younger couples is when you start having children. I know of many cases of people where the mom would like to stay home, but they have set up a life where that is just not possible. And now there are plenty of cases where that's true just because of their economic situation as a whole. Maybe they're not very high income people, don't have degrees, all this kind of things, and I'm very sympathetic to that. And that's just a very unfortunate reality, and those people have to do what they have to do. But there are lots of people who could have chosen to get a much smaller apartment, a smaller house, stick with the old car, not buy a new one, all of those kinds of things, and could have been in a place where they could have afforded their life on one income. But they chose not to do it. They chose to take their two big incomes and set up a life, and now they're looking at, if I quit my job, we're going to have to sell the house. And they're not willing to make that big of a leap so that they could stay home with the kids. But they want to, they're just not willing to make that big of a sacrifice. So what I would say is up front, set up your life so that one of you could stay home with the kids. That's not saying you have to do that, although it's a wonderful thing. It's what my wife did for many years. But give yourself the option. Give yourself the ability to do it. Because you never know how you're going to feel till you get there. And particularly, there's lots of women who've been convinced that their career is really important and they really want to do it and they're not going to want to give it up when they have children. And all of a sudden, they're holding a bundle of joy in their hands and they realize, forget the job. I'd rather be here. And if you've set up a life where that is not an option, it's a different form of being enslaved. You've become enslaved to that career, to that place. And I would strongly encourage you to do, if you can, everything you can to avoid it. I think I might have said that on the next slide here. Understand that marrying somebody very different than you has its practical challenge. We talked about it from a religious perspective, but I would also say it from cultural perspectives, financial backgrounds, those kinds of things. Again, it's not insurmountable, but those things will be struggles, and be very aware of them. Avoid someone with substance abuse warnings, and then be very realistic about economic needs. And here's a big one. You should know exactly what your partner owes in debt at the moment you get married. And the moment you got married, that is no longer their debt, it is your debt. Because you've joined yourself to them. Now, it may be true that if you got divorced, they'd have to take that debt with them, but that is not the right way to enter a marriage. You enter a marriage, and you are taking on that debt. And if you're not willing to do that, you shouldn't get married. I think it's really important, and this is really big with college debt. You see this a lot with people. They have debt through college. They get a lot of debt that's going to take them 20, 30 years to pay off, and either A, they don't tell the spouse to be about it, and how unconscionable is that, or B, they know about it, but they don't really fully embrace the idea that when getting married, they are taking on that debt. And they come with a lot of resentment of, we could have the big house, but my spouse still has $150,000 in college debt. If you're going to get married to someone who has debt, you need to take on the idea that you're taking on that debt. It's not their debt, it's your debt. Okay. Yeah, I went way over tonight. Apologies. Conclusion reminders, we are going to have questions at the very end. If you're online and you want to ask a question, get it in now. To do that, get logged in on YouTube and type all capitals Deacon Question, or go to deaconken.org/blog/chat. If you do that now, by the time we get to Q&A at the end, your question will be already queued up. Conclusion. Marriage is a great blessing, but it also takes a lot of work, and from one of my favorite singers, but it's good work if you can get it. Satisfaction survey. For those of you here in the room, we do have satisfaction surveys on the table. I really do look at them. I saw all 27 fix the popping sound, you moron, comments last month. And so therefore, I went out and bought some new hardware, and I created a new problem this month that you can say, fix the audio cutting out moron problem. So I really care. It does matter a lot to me. Please fill it out before you leave. For those of you online, in the description on the YouTube thing, there's a link to take you to do the satisfaction survey. I read them all. If you have something critical to say that would be valuable for me to follow up with you about, please put your name down. I'm not going to call you up and yell at you. I'm going to call you up and say, I'd like to understand the nature of the concern so that I can address it in future time. So one of my biggest regrets is when I see this very interesting criticism that I don't fully understand and it's not named, because then I can't reach out to them and say, I'm not quite understanding the concern. I'd love to be able to talk to you about it. Okay, the big reveal for topics for the rest of the year. I've been teasing that I had to come up with it by tonight. So here's what we're going to do for the rest of the year. Next month, March 14th, it's going to be how can I make the most of Mass? You know, for a lot of us, we kind of have been relatively recently coming back to Mass, or just the break got us in a funk, and we're struggling a little bit to really enjoy Mass. And so we're going to talk about ways we can do better at Mass. April 11th, this is highly requested. How can I bring my family back to the church? Everyone liked hearing from the converts last month, but they're like, that was friend-oriented. Friends are one thing, but trying to figure out how to get my kids back, that's something else. So we will talk about that in April. And then finally in May, how is the catechism organized? There's actually a lot of real good fruit there, and I thought that'd be a good one to finish the year with. We'll start the summer break in June, and I'm always looking for future topics for next year, so on the survey forms or on the online survey form, let me know what you're interested for the future. Some additional information, this is mostly for online, but you want to get a hold of me, Ken at deaconken.org, or to go to deaconken.org, the website, or the YouTube channel. Ways you can help. I definitely still need support. Actually, the refreshments team is coming along. We're doing better on that front. But childcare and live stream, I definitely need more help, particularly as time goes on. Live stream team, you do not need to know how to do anything. If you can turn your hand like this or you can push your finger like that, you are qualified to join the live stream team. So training is included. I very much need more people to help there, both for Faithful Questions, and we could use more people on the mass team as well. Child care, my hope here is that by having a lot of people, somebody doesn't have to miss every month, that you maybe only have to miss once or twice a year, because I have 10, 12, 14 people who are in a big rotation to do it. So what I particularly love here is to have a lot of parents who have kids who are that age, who are saying, if I do it once every 3-4 months, I can bring my kids, and if I get 8 other parents who are thinking that way, they don't have to miss that often. So really could use some help. If you'd like to sign up, there is a clipboard over here for signing up, or you can see me afterwards, or you can email me either at ken@deaconken.org or at the St. Clair Roseville email address. Oops, skipped a slide there. No, how did I do that? There we go. Okay. Spiritual direction. This is something I've been offering for a couple years now. I use an Ignatian model. I have limited availability, although I do have a couple spots right now. It is the expectation that you're going to commit to about a half hour a day of prayer that I am directing. But it is not free. My time is valuable. This is something that I'm as a deacon very dedicated to one person, and I do think it's important that that is valued. So it's $500 a year. I do have one scholarship available for someone who is unable to afford it. So if you really cannot afford the fee but you would like to do it, let me know. I do have a scholarship available from one of my current directees who thought it was so awesome, he's paying for somebody else to do it as well. So if that's not a good endorsement, I don't know what is. If you're interested, either come talk to me or go to deaconken.org/spiritual-direction. Finally, YouTube subscribing. Oh, I didn't update the number. I think I'm actually down to like 722 to go. But if you're not subscribed to me on YouTube, please do. Please sign up for 3 or 4 more Gmail accounts so you can subscribe 3 or more times. Anything we can do to get me closer to 1,000 where I can get all the features that go along with that would be good. All right, finally, on to questions. We'll start with online. Did we just lose our audio? No? Okay, we're going to swap batteries right now. If online, give me just 1 second while we make the switch. And we're back. Okay. Questions online? No questions online. Questions in the room? Here, go ahead. Oh, good. Wait for the mic.
Yeah, hi.
Nice and close.
Oh, I just had a question. You talked about marriage being life permanent, and so does that mean you can date in heaven?
Can you date in heaven?
Actually,
I think we will be on the biggest mega date of love with everybody. It's right.
Are there any theological insights though as to communicating in heaven or what it's happiness?
Yeah.
Has anybody speculated on that?
I'm sure somebody has. I haven't heard much of it. It's one of those things that's so speculative. We just know that we're in perfect union with God, and we know that it's a community of persons, and therefore we, in some sense, are in union with all of them, right? We talk about the body of believers, that we are all part of the body of Christ, and in much more perfectly so once in heaven. And that we would be united in that way to everybody, including the angels and all of that. So what that means, it's not the same as on earth, but it's something, and it would be very loving, one would assume. Other questions? Okay.
A statement, but not so much a question, but I am reminded through our Catholic faith that one of my responsibilities as a Catholic wife is to help my husband get to heaven, and he the same with me.
Absolutely.
And so I do think of that quite often. So the statement I wanted to make is that one of the things that I think has strengthened my marriage, and I think others here would probably agree, I see a lot of married couples here, that we share the same family and religious values. Even though he's not a Catholic, we share the same values for life, family, and marriage, and that's really critical.
I would agree. And it's one of those things that even where you have your differences, hopefully over time you're uniting yourself further, right?
Right on.
They say old couples are really like each other, and I think that's a good thing, right? That and I can see it in my wife and I, how I have picked up characteristics that were more hers in the early years, and she's definitely picked up characteristics that are mine. A joke in our family is we were going on our honeymoon, and I was like in her suitcase, like saying that shampoo's too big, all of this kind of thing. And she's like, "What the heck is with this jerk I just married?" And but now she's just like me. She's like, "We can't take a whole bottle of shampoo. Where's the travel shampoo?" Right? Those kinds of things where you evolve to each other is part of what we're after, right? Is we're
That's
getting
right.
closer and more unified and perfecting ourselves towards love of God, and therefore reaching heaven is a huge part of that. Absolutely.
Exactly. The other point I want to make is that I fall in love with my husband often, all the time. I look at him and I fall in love with him a lot, and I think that's helped our marriage. And it's not perfect. Trust me, our marriage is not perfect. The final thing I wanted to make a statement on was that our marriage, we have a strong sense of humor in our marriage, and I think that has been very beneficial. We laugh a lot, and I think that's healthy. It's healthy for the heart, the soul, and our marriage. So I thank God for that.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And I'd never haven't thought much about this in the past, but just hearing the way you said it, the word humility and humor, are those words? Do they have a root that makes them in common? Because people who laugh, part of laughing is an admission that something is not quite right? Not right in myself, not right in what we just did, not right in, something, and that's funny, right? I think humor is something that is in some way tied to humility, right? We're able to laugh at ourselves, we're able to laugh at each other, and we're able to take that humor lightly. It's not an attack on our pride, it's something that we can share with a certain sense of humility that that you wouldn't otherwise. So I would completely agree. Humor is very important, and I think in some way it's because it's tied to a jovial sense of humility. We'll come up here first and then to the back.
As a long, old married couple, I want to thank you for your talk. I think you really hit on everything. There is one thing I have noticed, and I think maybe that, and I can ask you if that is one reason of so much divorce, and that is selfishness. Mm-hmm. I see that, I can't get married until I can afford a big house, until I can finish my education. Well, we couldn't afford anything, but we had 4 kids, and they all came out great.
Yeah, there's a sense of, and you can see this in a lot of different ways, but this sense of, I only want a marriage that looks like X. And that is setting yourself up for disaster, because life moves on you. Life changes. Life goes places you didn't expect. And if you're in a place where I'm only willing to accept a marriage that looks like X, you're kind of doubling the chances that something throws you off, because something's going to go wrong with you or something's going to go wrong with them, and that wasn't the marriage you signed up for. You have to sign up for the idea that I don't know what I'm signing up for. The only thing I'm signing up for is being hooked to this person, and where that leads is where it leads. And you're absolutely right. This idea of I have to wait till I have an education, I have to wait until I have money, I have to wait until da-da-da-da, all comes from a place of expectation setting that can be have negative effects in a marriage. You want to enter into the marriage of it doesn't matter where it goes, but this person's going to be my companion on that journey. Yeah.
So 2 of the best books that I've read this past year were The 5 Love Languages, and then the other is Love and Respect. Have you heard of that one?
I haven't. Who's that one by?
I'll have to look it up on my phone. It was an audiobook.
Okay.
The love she so desperately desires, the respect he so desperately needs. In that book, the author, who I don't think is Catholic, but the book is very much focused around Ephesians.
Okay.
Ephesians 5. And one aspect in there, he talks about the crazy wheel. You're constantly on this crazy wheel of, well, he does this and then she does that and then he does this and then she, and it's like you all have to just stop at some point and say, okay, I'm gonna stop doing that, and then they will. So you mentioned something similar to that in the first half of your talk. Well, they did this to me, so I reacted this way, and well, they did that to me, so I'm going to react this way. Do you have any suggestions or insights on who goes first? Like, how do you get to that point where the one person finally says, "Okay, I'm going to be the bigger person"? And
yeah, right. Yeah. And so the great marriages are where the 2 people are rushing to be the first one, not the being the case where they're waiting for the other one, right? And so I think it's that kind of where our Catholic faith is so healthy, is because we are such a people of forgiveness. I think it can have a lot of benefits in this department of we are more likely to run to forgiveness. And we start not by waiting for forgiveness, but by offering forgiveness. So you're absolutely right. That's how you do it, is you get off the wheel by offering it, and you just have to be that person who swallows your pride and says, I'm going to be the first one. I'm going to be the one to offer the olive branch. And this is, again, where the permanence of marriage really helps, because I think a lot more people are willing to go first if they have trust that the other person is not going to take that opportunity to bolt or abuse or whatever. And so it makes it easier to go first, because you expect someday you're going to get your return there too, if you're going to be somewhat contractual about it. But yeah, it's so frustrating to me to see in other people there. You got 2 people who are so close, they just can't get off this. I've got 6 blames I've got to work out first. It's like, let them go, forgive. And then that will open up the doors to them for forgiving you. And I don't have any great advice on how to get that ball started, but maybe one piece of advice would be to recognize in the past when that was valuable. So for couples who've been married for a while, you've probably had 2 or 3 times you've crossed that bridge. And so seeing how that worked out hopefully is an incentive in the future. So having maybe a little bit of reflection to look back in your life and see how good it was when that happened before can help give you the incentive to do it now. Best I got. Other questions before we wrap up?
Test. So, Ken, I see your red and white tie.
Or pink
And white. I'm colorblind.
For Valentine's Day.
And you mentioned Valentine's in the posting of this. So where's one of the better places to go for dinner on Valentine's Day?
I actually have a
We're
awesome
new to
suggestion.
Roseville, so we need some assistance.
I've got the best suggestion. This is my wife's. She's watching. She's probably busting up right now. Papa Murphy's does a wonderful take and bake heart-shaped pizza. I'm telling you, bring it home. I am not for the. And God bless my wife, because I think she would like to go out more than I do. But I just think it's one of the worst days of the year to go out to a restaurant because it's so overwhelmed, you know. And there's all of these people who are overworked and all of that. It's like, and I love my wife 365 days a year. Why are we torturing ourselves on the one day that people are out there? So our strategy is the take and bake pizza, and then Papa Murphy's does have a heart-shaped pizza to get you into it. So I may have just, made your wife very unhappy, but that would be my suggestion.
My father said New Year's Eve was for amateurs, so maybe this Valentine's Day is for amateurs.
Okay, yeah, New Year's Eve for amateurs. All right, yeah.
On that note, my mother's last name was Valentine.
Okay.
And Valentine's Day was always celebrated with my mother's parents, my mom and dad. And so going out or having pizza delivered, no, not for me.
I actually make it a point to try to get flowers like either a month before or a month after Valentine's Day, because I think it's ridiculous like how much it costs on Valentine's Day. But it's like, no, I love you all year long, and so I think you deserve Valentine's Day in April as much as you deserve it in February, and so try to go about it that way and see if that goes over. I don't know. Other questions before we wrap up? All right. Well, we'll take that. And any final online questions before we... Nope. We will wrap up with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, thank you again for bringing us together and for the many ways that you bless us. Thank you for the technology that makes this possible, even though it sometimes is uncooperative. And thank you for the gift of our marriages. Help us to appreciate how much of a gift they are, and help us to share that gift with the rest of the world. We ask all of this through Christ our Lord and Savior. Amen. God bless you all. Have a wonderful evening.